I should have known something was wrong the moment my daughter-in-law smiled at me and said, "Don't worry, Margaret. Tonight is all about you." I remember standing in front of my bedroom mirror that afternoon, sunlight coming through the lace curtains of the house my husband and I bought 38 years ago, brushing my fingers over the navy blue silk dress hanging on the closet door. Thomas had given it to me on our 30th wedding anniversary, tucked inside a white department store box with a handwritten note that said, "For the only woman who has ever truly known me." I hadn't worn it in years. It felt too precious, too tied to memories of candlelit dinners and slow dances in the kitchen after our son went to bed. That morning, Ashley had insisted I choose something lighter for the retirement party, something more modern, something that would photograph well at the country club. She even offered to drop off a garment bag she said would be perfect. I let her help. After 42 years of teaching third grade in the same public school, after early mornings and late-night lesson plans, and spending my own money on classroom supplies, I thought maybe it was nice to let someone else take charge for once. The party was held at the Willow Creek Country Club just outside town, the kind of place with white columns and neatly trimmed hedges, where iced tea is served in tall glasses with lemon wedges balanced on the rim. My former colleagues were there, parents of students I taught a decade ago, even the superintendent who shook my hand and told me I had shaped generations. There was a banner with my name in gold script. A slideshow of old classroom photos played near the bar. I felt proud. I felt seen. And then the doors opened behind me. I didn't turn at first. I just heard the soft hush of conversation shift, like wind moving through dry leaves. When I did turn, my breath stopped halfway in my chest. Ashley was standing at the entrance, one hand resting lightly on her hip, smiling as if she were arriving at her own celebration. And she was wearing my dress. The navy silk fell exactly the way I remembered, skimming her figure, catching the light with that subtle sheen I used to love. For a split second I told myself it was a coincidence, that maybe she had found something similar. But I knew that dress. I knew the small stitched repair near the hem from when I caught it on a kitchen drawer handle years ago. I knew the delicate pearl buttons at the back. I knew because that dress had once symbolized my marriage. My eyes moved instinctively to Thomas. He was already looking at her. Not surprised. Not confused. Just looking. And in that look, steady, almost proud, I felt something inside me grow very still. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't even anger. It was recognition. As if a puzzle piece I'd been ignoring for months had finally clicked into place. I smiled for the guests. I thanked them for coming. I accepted hugs and compliments. But in that moment, watching my daughter-in-law wearing the fabric of my memories while my husband's gaze lingered too long, I realized this retirement party was not the end of my career. It was the beginning of the truth. For the rest of the evening, I played my role perfectly. I laughed when the superintendent told a story about the time my class built a cardboard model of the solar system that collapsed before the science fair. I thanked former students who were now in their 30s and 40s, telling me I had been their favorite teacher. I held my glass of sparkling water steady, even though my fingers felt strangely cold. Every few minutes, my eyes drifted back to Ashley. She moved through the room as if she belonged there, as if she were the one being celebrated. People complimented her dress. I watched her tilt her head and say, almost shyly, that it was vintage. She did not look at me when she said it. Thomas stayed close to her side more than he stayed near mine. That alone would have been unusual. For decades, at every school banquet, every holiday party, he had hovered near me with quiet loyalty, refilling my drink, resting a hand at the small of my back. That night, he laughed at something Ashley whispered to him, and I saw him lean in so he could hear her better over the music. It was a small movement. It should have meant nothing. But I have been married long enough to know the difference between polite attention and private familiarity. When it was time for the toast, my son Daniel tapped his fork gently against his glass. He spoke about my dedication, about how I never missed a school play or a parent conference. His voice trembled with pride, and for a moment I felt guilty for letting my mind wander toward suspicion. Then Thomas stood up beside him. He cleared his throat and said he wanted to honor not only my career but the women who had shaped his life. He mentioned me first, of course. 42 years of marriage. A partner through every high and low. Then he turned slightly, just enough that his body angled toward Ashley. He called her a bright light in our family, someone who had brought energy and inspiration into our home. The room applauded. I did too. But I noticed the way his eyes softened when he looked at her, a softness I had not seen directed at me in a very long time. Later, while guests crowded around the dessert table, I stepped outside onto the terrace for air. The evening was cool, somewhere in the low 60s, the kind of early fall night that carries the faint scent of cut grass. Through the tall glass windows, I could see them standing closer than necessary. Not touching, not doing anything that would cause a scene, just standing in a space that felt closed, private, as if the rest of the party had blurred around them. And in that quiet moment, I realized something even more unsettling than the dress itself. This was not new. This was practiced. Whatever existed between my husband and my daughter-in-law had been building long before tonight. I had simply chosen not to see it. When we finally returned home that night, the house felt unfamiliar to me, as if I were stepping into a place I used to recognize but no longer fully understood. Thomas walked in ahead of me, loosening his tie, placing his keys in the ceramic bowl by the door the way he had done every evening for decades. The routine was the same. The silence was not. I set my purse down on the hallway table and noticed the faint scent of Ashley's perfume lingering in the air, something floral and expensive that did not belong in a home that once smelled like lemon cleaner and Sunday pot roast. I told myself I was imagining it, that my mind was searching for confirmation because my heart was already uneasy. Thomas asked if I had enjoyed the party. His voice was casual, almost too casual, as if he were asking about the weather. I studied his face, looking for guilt, for discomfort, for anything that might resemble confession. Instead, I saw composure. Years ago, I used to tell my third graders that when someone avoids your eyes, they might be hiding something. That night, Thomas held my gaze without hesitation. It was steady, practiced. I answered that the party was lovely and thanked him for helping organize it. He nodded, then mentioned that Ashley had worked very hard on the decorations and the slideshow. He spoke her name gently, with appreciation that felt deeper than gratitude. I asked, as evenly as I could, how she happened to find that dress. He paused, only for a fraction of a second, but long enough for me to notice. He said she must have seen it in the closet the last time she visited and admired it, and that he told her she could borrow it if she wanted. Borrow it. The word echoed in my mind. That dress had never been offered to anyone. Not to friends, not to family. It had been a symbol of something private between husband and wife. I smiled faintly and said nothing more. Later, while he showered, I sat on the edge of our bed and let the quiet settle around me. I began to replay the past 6 months with a clarity I had not allowed myself before. The afternoons when Ashley stopped by just to check in, while Daniel was at work. The evenings when Thomas suddenly volunteered to help her with minor repairs at her house 30 minutes away. The way he had grown more protective of his phone, taking it with him even to the mailbox at the end of our driveway. None of those details had seemed alarming on their own. Together, they formed a pattern. I did not cry. I did not confront him. Instead, I walked downstairs to the small desk in the den where we kept our household files. I opened the drawer that held our security system login information. We had installed cameras 2 years earlier after a neighbor reported car break-ins on the street. I had never felt the need to review the footage before. That night, for the first time in my life, I felt compelled to look at what had been happening in my own home when I was not paying attention. I sat at the desk in the den with only the small brass lamp turned on, the rest of the house dark and quiet except for the steady hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. My hands were calm as I typed in the security system password, the same anniversary date Thomas had chosen years ago. The screen displayed a grid of timestamps and tiny thumbnails from the past several months. I told myself I was only being thorough, that a sensible woman confirms facts before allowing her imagination to wander. I selected a date from late spring, one of the weekends Thomas claimed he had driven to Boston for a consulting meeting. I remembered that weekend clearly because I had attended a retired teacher's luncheon alone. The footage loaded slowly. At 10:42 that Friday night, our front porch light flicked on. At 10:47, a familiar sedan pulled into the driveway. Ashley stepped out. She was not carrying luggage. She was not holding paperwork. She walked to the front door with the ease of someone who had done it many times. Seconds later, the door opened from inside. Thomas did not look surprised. He stepped aside to let her in. The door closed behind them. There was no sign of hesitation, no awkwardness, no confusion about why she was there. I fast-forwarded. At 7:15 the next morning, she left wearing different clothes from the ones she had arrived in. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to keep breathing slowly, the way I used to instruct anxious parents during conferences. One clip could have been explained. A late conversation. An innocent misunderstanding. So I checked another date. And another. Over and over, the pattern repeated itself. Evenings when Daniel was traveling for work. Afternoons when I was volunteering at the library. Ashley arriving. Thomas opening the door. Hours passing. The camera in the living room showed them sitting close on the sofa, heads inclined toward one another in quiet conversation. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would shock a stranger. But intimacy does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it is measured in inches, in the absence of distance. I leaned back in the chair and folded my hands in my lap. 42 years of marriage teaches a woman how to read the smallest shifts in a man's posture. I did not need to see anything improper to understand what I was witnessing. I closed the laptop gently, as if it contained fragile glass rather than the fracture of my own history. Upstairs, I could hear the shower water shut off. Thomas began to move around the bedroom, unaware that the narrative of our life together had just changed. I did not storm upstairs. I did not demand explanations. Instead, I walked to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and stood at the sink looking out at the dark backyard. The oak tree we planted when Daniel was 5 stood tall and steady, its branches unmoved by the light breeze. I realized then that I had 2 choices. I could confront them in anger and be dismissed as emotional and confused, or I could remain silent, gather every fact, and decide my next step with the same patience that built my career and my home. That night, I chose patience. The next morning, I woke up at 6:30 out of habit, even though I no longer had a classroom waiting for me. For a few seconds, I lay still and listened to the quiet rhythm of Thomas breathing beside me. He looked peaceful, untouched by the knowledge that had kept me awake most of the night. I studied the ceiling and allowed myself exactly 5 minutes to feel the weight of it all. 5 minutes to acknowledge that the life I believed in had shifted. After that, I got out of bed, put on my robe, and went downstairs to start the coffee as I had done for years. Routine can be a powerful anchor when everything else feels uncertain. When Thomas joined me in the kitchen, he kissed my cheek and thanked me again for a beautiful evening. His tone was warm, familiar, almost affectionate. I poured his coffee and asked about his plans for the day. He mentioned running errands and stopping by the hardware store. I nodded, making mental notes not of what he said, but of how easily he said it. After he left the house, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and opened our joint bank account. I had always trusted him to handle most of the investments. I preferred lesson plans to spreadsheets. Now, I reviewed every transaction with careful attention. There were restaurant charges in towns 30 miles away on afternoons he claimed to be at meetings. There were small but consistent withdrawals of cash that I could not recall discussing. None of it was dramatic on its own. Together, it told a story of secrecy. I printed the statements and placed them neatly in a manila folder. Then I checked the credit card history for the past year. A boutique purchase I did not recognize. The date matched one of the evenings Ashley appeared on the security footage. I remembered complimenting her once on a silk scarf she wore to Sunday dinner. She had smiled and said it was a gift. I had not asked from whom. I closed my eyes briefly, not in despair, but in clarity. This was no longer about suspicion. It was about evidence. Around noon, Ashley sent a group message to the family thanking everyone for attending the party and saying how honored she felt to celebrate me. I read her words slowly. The phrasing was polished, thoughtful, almost tender. I wondered how long she had been practicing that tone. I replied with a simple thank you and added a heart emoji, the same way I always had. Let them believe I was unaware. Let them feel comfortable. In the early afternoon, I made an appointment with a family attorney whose office was downtown, 2 blocks from the courthouse. I did not explain details over the phone. I only said I needed to review my estate documents and discuss options. My voice did not tremble. When I hung up, I looked around the kitchen, at the oak cabinets Thomas and I had installed ourselves decades ago, at the photographs lining the wall of birthdays and graduations and Christmas mornings. I had built this life patiently, thoughtfully, brick by brick. If something had been quietly taken from me, I would not respond with chaos. I would respond with preparation. 2 days later, I sat in a leather chair across from a woman named Patricia Lawson, whose office overlooked Main Street and the brick courthouse that had stood there for more than a century. I had chosen her because she specialized in family law and estate planning, and because no one in my immediate circle used her services. I did not want whispers traveling faster than facts. Patricia listened without interrupting as I explained that I needed to review my will, my trust, and the structure of our shared assets. I did not begin with accusations. I began with practical questions. What would happen to my pension if I filed for divorce? How were our retirement accounts divided under state law? What protections existed for someone who had contributed decades to a marriage both financially and domestically? She answered calmly, outlining options with a yellow legal pad in front of her. When she asked if there had been infidelity, I paused only briefly before saying that I had reason to believe there was an inappropriate relationship within my extended family. I did not elaborate. I did not need to. She nodded with professional understanding and advised me to continue documenting everything. When I left her office, the autumn air felt sharper, clearer. For the first time since the party, I felt something close to steadiness. Knowledge can restore balance when emotion threatens to overwhelm it. That evening, Thomas mentioned that Ashley had invited us to Sunday brunch at her house. Daniel would be there as well. I watched him carefully as he spoke. There was no visible tension in his posture, no hesitation in his tone. If he knew, he hid it well. I agreed to attend. On Sunday, I wore a simple cream sweater and pearl earrings, nothing that carried memory or symbolism. Ashley greeted us at the door with practiced warmth. I stepped inside and noticed the navy dress folded neatly over the back of a dining chair, as if waiting to be returned. She saw my eyes land on it, and quickly said she meant to have it dry cleaned. I smiled and told her not to worry about it. Throughout brunch, I observed more than I spoke. Thomas refilled her coffee before she asked. She laughed at his stories a fraction of a second too quickly. Daniel remained unaware, discussing a new project at work, trusting the room he sat in. I felt a flicker of sadness for my son, but I reminded myself that truth, when revealed correctly, protects more than it harms. After we left, I did not confront Thomas in the car. Instead, I asked him about his plans for the coming week. He mentioned another out-of-town meeting scheduled for Thursday night. I nodded and made a quiet decision. I would not follow him. I would not argue. I would prepare. Because by now, this was no longer about confirming what I already understood. It was about choosing the moment when silence would end and consequences would begin. On Thursday evening, Thomas packed a small overnight bag and told me he would be staying near the airport because his meeting was scheduled early the next morning. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom and watched him fold his shirts with deliberate care. There was a time when I would have walked over, straightened his collar, and slipped a note into his pocket wishing him luck. That night, I only asked what time he expected to be home the following day. He said late afternoon, depending on traffic. I nodded and told him to drive safely. After he left, the house felt still but not empty. It felt observant, as if the walls themselves were aware that something decisive was unfolding. At 9:30, I logged into the security system again, not because I needed more proof, but because confirmation strengthens resolve. At 10:12, headlights swept across the driveway. Ashley's sedan. She stepped out wearing a long cardigan and carrying a small tote bag. She did not knock. The front door opened within seconds. I watched the timestamp in the corner of the screen as they disappeared inside together. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice in an empty room. Instead, I opened the folder on my desk and added the new date to my handwritten list. Patterns matter in court. Consistency matters in negotiations. Around midnight, I closed the laptop and made myself chamomile tea. I sat at the kitchen table and thought about the woman I had been at 26, standing in a church in a simple white dress, believing loyalty was a permanent structure. I thought about the years I spent supporting Thomas through career changes, relocations, and financial uncertainty. I had managed our home with discipline and pride. I had never once considered that I would need to protect myself from the man I had trusted most. The next morning, I drove to the bank and opened an individual account in my name only, transferring a portion of my personal savings that had been set aside from inheritance money my parents left me. It was legal. It was documented. It was prudent. When Thomas returned the following day, he looked relaxed, almost refreshed. He mentioned that the meeting went well and that he might consider more consulting work in the future. I listened carefully, noticing how easily the story flowed. Later that evening, Ashley sent another cheerful message about planning a small family gathering to celebrate my retirement more intimately. I read it twice. A small gathering. Everyone together. The timing felt almost ironic. I responded that I would be delighted and suggested hosting it at our house the following Sunday. I could almost feel the shift, subtle but real. They believed I remained unaware, still trusting, still grateful. What they did not understand was that silence can be strategic, and I was almost ready to choose the moment when the truth would no longer sit quietly behind a screen, but stand clearly in the center of the room. Sunday arrived with a crisp blue sky and the kind of quiet suburban calm that makes neighbors wash their cars and rake their leaves. I woke up early and moved through the house with deliberate purpose. I polished the dining table until the wood reflected the light from the chandelier. I set out the good china that had been stored in the cabinet for special occasions, the same set we used at Daniel's graduation dinner. I arranged white roses in a crystal vase at the center of the table, simple and elegant. If this was going to be the moment everything shifted, it would unfold in a room that reflected dignity, not chaos. Around noon, Patricia emailed me the finalized documents. The revised will. The updated trust. The paperwork initiating formal separation proceedings, ready to be filed the following morning. I printed copies and placed them neatly into individual envelopes, each labeled in careful handwriting. I did not feel revenge. I felt clarity. By 2 o'clock, Daniel and Ashley arrived together. She carried a pie from a local bakery and kissed my cheek as if nothing in the world had changed. Thomas followed shortly after, offering to open a bottle of wine. I watched them all move through my kitchen, through the space I had managed and maintained for nearly 4 decades. Conversation floated easily at first. Daniel spoke about an upcoming business trip. Ashley complimented the table setting. Thomas rested, his hand briefly on the back of her chair as he passed behind her, a gesture subtle enough to dismiss, but intimate enough for me to notice. When we sat down to eat, I allowed the meal to progress without interruption. I asked Daniel about work. I asked Ashley about her volunteer committee. I observed how comfortable they both seemed, unaware that the ground beneath them was about to shift. After dessert, I folded my napkin and placed it beside my plate. My voice, when I began to speak, was steady and calm. I told them how proud I was of the family we had built and how important honesty had always been in this house. Then I reached for the small remote on the side table and turned on the television mounted above the fireplace. The security footage filled the screen, timestamp clear in the corner. The room fell silent except for the faint hum of the video playing. I did not narrate. I did not accuse. I allowed the images to speak for themselves. Ashley's face drained of color. Thomas shifted in his chair, but said nothing. Daniel stared at the screen, confusion turning slowly into comprehension. When the clip ended, I turned off the television and placed 3 envelopes on the table. I explained that I had consulted an attorney, that the necessary legal steps were already prepared, and that my retirement would mark not only the end of my career, but the end of any arrangement built on deception. I looked at my son and told him the truth was not meant to destroy him, but to protect him from living inside a lie. The house remained quiet, heavy with realization. For the first time in months, I felt no uncertainty, only resolve. No one spoke for several seconds after the screen went dark. The only sound in the room was the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, steady and indifferent to the unraveling of a family. Daniel was the first to find his voice. He did not shout. He did not accuse. He simply asked, very quietly, if what he had just seen was real. I met his eyes and told him that every clip had been recorded in our home over the past several months, and that I had verified each date carefully. Ashley's hands trembled where they rested on the table, but she said nothing. Thomas attempted to speak, using words like misunderstanding and companionship, but even he seemed to recognize how hollow they sounded in a room filled with evidence. I did not engage in debate. I had not gathered proof in order to argue. I had gathered it in order to conclude. I explained that the separation documents would be filed the next morning and that the revised estate plan removed any inheritance provisions connected to Thomas. I made it clear that my personal savings and the portion of assets protected under state law would remain under my control. I turned to Daniel and told him that my love for him had not changed and would not change, but that I would not sacrifice my dignity to preserve an illusion. He looked between his father and his wife, the weight of realization settling over him like a heavy coat. I could see the grief forming in his expression, not only for his marriage but for the image of his parents he had believed in. Ashley finally whispered that she never intended to hurt anyone. I listened without interruption, then told her that intention does not erase impact. Choices carry consequences, especially when they are made in secret. I stood from the table slowly, smoothing the front of my sweater, and gathered the envelopes that remained unopened. I told Thomas that he could arrange to collect his belongings once temporary living arrangements were settled, and that all communication regarding finances would proceed through attorneys. My voice did not waver. I had spent decades teaching children how to take responsibility for their actions. It was time the adults in my home did the same. As I walked toward the staircase, I paused briefly and looked back at the dining room I had prepared so carefully that morning. The white roses remained upright in their vase, untouched by the tension that had filled the air. I realized then that retirement had given me something I had not expected, the freedom to choose myself. I had retired from a career built on patience and integrity, and in the same week, I had retired from a marriage that no longer honored either. Whatever conversations unfolded after I left the room belonged to them. I had already stepped into the next chapter of my life, not as a victim of betrayal, but as a woman who refused to be diminished by it.